Long before the iconic imagery of buckle-hatted pilgrims and stuffed turkeys became a staple of American culture, a group of radical dissenters was making a choice that would alter the geopolitical landscape of the world. While history often paints a picture of simplistic piety, the reality was a complex web of religious persecution, economic desperation, and a profound desire for cultural preservation. Some historians argue that the primary motivation for their departure from the Netherlands was not just religious freedom, but the fear that their children were becoming too Dutch and losing their English identity. Had this small congregation chosen to remain in the safety of Leiden, the North American continent might have developed under entirely different colonial influences. Rarely has a single decision by such a small group of people carried so much weight for future generations. In the early 17th century, the religious landscape of England was characterized by intense upheaval and the rigid enforcement of the Act of Uniformity. The Church of England, having broken away from Rome, still retained many rituals that the Puritans found suspiciously similar to Catholic traditions. Among these reformers were the Separatists, a group so committed to their vision of a pure church that they felt they must sever ties with the national institution entirely. Consequently, they faced severe legal penalties, including heavy fines, imprisonment, and in some extreme cases, execution for their nonconformity. To escape this oppressive atmosphere, the congregation fled to the Netherlands, a nation renowned for its relative tolerance of diverse religious practices. However, life in Leiden was far from an idyllic sanctuary for the English exiles. They found themselves working grueling hours in the textile industry, struggling to maintain their communal bonds amidst a foreign urban environment. Moreover, the impending end of a 12-year truce between the Dutch Republic and Spain threatened to bring the horrors of war to their doorstep once again. The economic reality of the separatists in Leiden is often overlooked in popular history, yet it was the primary catalyst for their migration. Most of the members were former farmers who found themselves unskilled and underpaid in the sophisticated urban economy of the Dutch textile centres. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty that made it impossible to support their ageing members or provide a prosperous future for the youth. They watched with growing alarm as their children began to adopt Dutch speech and local customs, effectively diluting the purity of their English heritage. In this section, you heard phrases like "to sever ties with" and "renowned for." These expressions are useful for describing the ending of formal relationships and identifying someone's reputation in advanced English contexts. The decision to relocate to the New World was not made lightly, as it involved navigating the treacherous waters of both the Atlantic Ocean and colonial bureaucracy. Securing a patent from the Virginia Company required immense negotiation and the backing of wealthy merchant adventurers who expected a significant return on their investment. These investors were not motivated by religious zeal, but by the cold calculations of profit and loss. They viewed the colonists as a workforce whose primary job was to harvest timber furs and fish to pay off the massive debts incurred by the expedition. Initially, 2 ships were intended for the voyage, the Speedwell and the larger, more famous Mayflower. The Speedwell, however, proved to be hopelessly unseaworthy, leaking so badly that it forced the combined group to crowd onto the Mayflower alone. By the time the single vessel departed from Plymouth in September 1620, the season for safe Atlantic crossings had already begun to wane. The passengers, totaling 102 individuals, were packed into a space no larger than a modern volleyball court. During the 66-day crossing, the ship was battered by ferocious gales that cracked one of the main structural beams. If the sailors had not used a large iron screw to jack the beam back into place, the voyage would undoubtedly have ended in a maritime catastrophe. Never before had these landlocked families faced such a relentless onslaught of nature and physical discomfort. The interior of the Mayflower was a dark, damp and claustrophobic environment that tested the limits of human endurance. Sanitation was non-existent, and the diet consisted primarily of hardtack salted pork and beer, which was often the only safe liquid to drink. Seasickness was a constant companion for almost every passenger, making the task of basic survival an agonizing ordeal. The 'tween deck where the families lived was only 5 feet high, forcing most adults to remain hunched or seated for months. In the midst of this misery, a young man named John Howland was swept overboard during a violent storm. By some miracle, he managed to grab hold of a trailing topsail halyard and was hauled back on board by the exhausted crew. This incident served as a stark reminder of how thin the line was between life and death on the high seas. The tension on board was not merely between the passengers and the sea, but also between the saints and the strangers. The saints were the religious separatists, while the strangers were the secular workers recruited by the investors to ensure the colony's economic success. These two groups held vastly different worldviews, leading to frequent disputes about authority and the future of the settlement. As they neared the American coast, some of the strangers argued that since they were landing outside their legal patent, they were no longer bound by any rules. To prevent total anarchy before they even stepped ashore, the leaders drafted a revolutionary document known as the Mayflower Compact. In the previous paragraphs, we employed the phrase, "to be plagued by," which describes being continually troubled by something negative. Additionally, notice the inversion structure. Never before had these families faced. This is a powerful way to emphasize intensity in formal storytelling. Try incorporating this pattern of never plus auxiliary verb into your own speaking to sound more natural in academic English. On a cold November morning, the weary travellers finally caught sight of the sandy hook of Cape Cod. While they were initially relieved to see land, they soon realized that they were hundreds of miles north of their intended destination. The landscape that greeted them was far from the fertile paradise they might have envisioned in their prayers. Instead, they saw a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men as recorded in their journals. Despite the bleak outlook, the passengers were forced to remain on the ship for several more weeks as scouting parties searched for a landing site. The search was plagued by freezing temperatures and the constant fear of the unknown inhabitants of the land. The signing of the Mayflower Compact established a crucial precedent for self-governance that would eventually influence the founding of a nation. It was a fragile agreement, born of necessity, intended to hold a fractured community together in the face of certain death. As the first winter approached, the settlers had no way of knowing that half of their number would not live to see the following spring. The optimism of their arrival was quickly overshadowed by the harsh reality of the Massachusetts coast. While they had successfully crossed the ocean, their greatest struggle, the battle against starvation and disease, was only just beginning. Within months, a chance encounter with a lone man speaking broken English would change the destiny of the entire colony. The silence of the woods was about to be broken. The arrival at Plymouth Rock was not the triumphant moment often depicted in modern textbooks, but rather a desperate gamble for survival against a landscape that felt increasingly hostile. While the settlers had successfully crossed the Atlantic, they quickly realized that the vast wilderness of Massachusetts offered no immediate shelter from the biting winds of December. Some historical accounts suggest that the choice of Plymouth was influenced by a lack of beer, which at the time was considered a primary source of hydration and nutrition. Had the Mayflower docked further south in the milder climate of the Hudson River, the catastrophic loss of life that winter might have been significantly mitigated. Records indicate that during the first few months, the mortality rate was so high that at times only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to tend to the sick and bury the dead. This period, often referred to as the starving time, tested the very foundations of the colonists' faith and their commitment to the New World. The transition from the cramped quarters of the ship to the frozen ground of the settlement was a brutal introduction to their new lives. They found themselves caught between the necessity of building permanent structures and the physical exhaustion caused by scurvy and respiratory infections. Consequently, the Mayflower remained their primary residence for most of the winter, serving as a floating hospital for the dying. By the time the first warm breezes of March arrived, nearly half of the passengers and crew had perished, leaving the survivors in a state of profound grief and uncertainty. Moreover, the psychological toll of burying their loved ones in unmarked graves to hide their dwindling numbers from potential enemies was immense. The fear of being discovered in a weakened state by the indigenous population dominated their collective consciousness. However, the silence of the forest was eventually broken by a moment that would fundamentally shift the trajectory of the colony. In mid-March, a lone man named Samoset walked boldly into the settlement and greeted the startled Englishmen in their own language. He had learned English from fishermen who frequented the coast of present-day Maine, and his arrival served as a bridge between two vastly different worlds. This encounter was the first step in a complex diplomatic dance that would lead to one of the most significant alliances in colonial history. Samoset soon returned with Squanto, also known as Tisquantum, whose life story was a tragic odyssey of kidnapping, slavery, and resilience. Squanto spoke much better English, having spent several years in London after being captured by an English explorer and sold into slavery in Spain. Upon his eventual return to his homeland, he discovered that his entire tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by an epidemic likely brought by earlier European visitors. Finding himself a man without a country, Squanto chose to devote his skills to helping the struggling settlers at Plymouth. He taught them how to plant maize or Indian corn, a crop that was entirely unfamiliar to the European farmers. Squanto demonstrated how to use fish as fertilizer by burying small alewives in the soil, along with the corn seeds, to provide essential nutrients. Without his guidance, it is highly probable that the colony would have succumbed to starvation before the next harvest. In the previous paragraphs, you heard phrases like "to be wiped out" and "to succumb to." These phrasal verbs are essential for describing the complete destruction of a group or the act of giving in to an overwhelming force like disease or pressure. Notice how we used to wipe out to describe the tragic end of the Patuxet tribe. This is a common expression in academic history. The relationship between the settlers and the Wampanoag Confederacy was formalized through a peace treaty with their leader, Massasoit. This treaty was not merely a gesture of goodwill, but a strategic alliance born of mutual necessity and political calculation. The Wampanoag had also been severely weakened by the recent plague and viewed the newcomers as potential allies against their rivals, the Narragansett. Therefore, the first Thanksgiving was less a religious holiday and more of a diplomatic celebration of a successful military and economic partnership. As the summer of 1621 progressed, the settlers saw their hard work finally begin to bear fruit in the fields. The corn grew tall and the woods provided an abundance of game, including wild turkey deer and waterfowl. When the harvest was gathered in October, Governor William Bradford organized a 3-day feast to celebrate their survival and give thanks for their bounty. They invited Massasoit and 90 of his men, who brought 5 deer to contribute to the communal meal. Contrary to popular belief, the menu did not consist of pumpkin pie or cranberry sauce, as the settlers lacked both flour and sugar. Instead, they feasted on venison-roasted fowl shellfish and a variety of native vegetables like squash and beans. This event represented a brief shining moment of intercultural cooperation that would later be romanticized as the origin story of a nation. Nevertheless, the underlying tensions regarding land ownership and cultural differences remained just beneath the surface. The feast was as much an exercise in military display as it was a celebration of peace, with the English performing drills with their muskets to impress their guests. The Wampanoag, in turn, demonstrated their own skills and strength, ensuring that the balance of power remained clearly understood. Rarely had two such different cultures managed to find common ground in the midst of such immense hardship and mutual suspicion. While the 1621 feast was a success, it did not signal the end of the colony's struggles or the beginning of a permanent era of peace. The following year would bring new challenges, including a shortage of food and the arrival of more settlers who did not share the original group's vision. The reliance on Squanto continued to be a point of both gratitude and friction within the small community. His influence with the local tribes made some of the English leaders wary of his true intentions and his growing power. As we reflect on this era, we see that the survival of Plymouth was a near miss in the grand scheme of history. It was a story of unexpected help, extreme loss, and the pragmatic alliances that define the human experience in times of crisis. In this chapter, we explored the concept of a strategic alliance and mutual necessity, which are crucial terms for discussing international relations and history. The 1621 Harvest Festival provided a template for gratitude, but the years that followed would test whether that gratitude could withstand the pressure of expansion. The peace established by the treaty with Massasoit would last for over 50 years, but the seeds of future conflict were already being sown in the very soil they cultivated. While the settlers enjoyed their brief moment of plenty, the arrival of a second ship, the fortune would soon push the colony back to the brink of starvation. New faces were coming, but they brought no supplies, only more mouths to feed, and new ideas about how the land should be governed. The fragile balance of Plymouth was about to be tested by its own success. As the dust settled on the first few decades of the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies, the concept of Thanksgiving began to evolve into something far more complex than a simple harvest festival. While modern observers might assume that the holiday followed a linear path from 1621 to the present, the historical reality was a sporadic series of proclamations that varied wildly from year to year. Some historians point out that for the early Puritans, a day of Thanksgiving was actually a solemn religious occasion, often preceded by a day of fasting and humiliation. Had these religious leaders not viewed every success or failure as a direct sign from God, the tradition of declaring official days of gratitude might never have taken root in the American psyche. Records from the mid-17th century reveal that these days were called whenever the community experienced a specific stroke of good fortune, such as the safe arrival of a supply ship or the end of a drought. The holiday was not yet a fixed date on the calendar, but rather a reactionary tool used by the church and state to maintain social order and religious piety. This period of transformation saw the holiday shift from a spontaneous communal meal to a structured civil requirement. Throughout the colonial era, the New England colonies Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island became the primary guardians of this burgeoning tradition. Consequently, Thanksgiving became deeply associated with the New England way, a specific cultural and religious identity that often excluded other regions of the expanding colonies. By the time of the American Revolution, the practice of giving thanks had taken on a new, more political dimension. Moreover, the Continental Congress recognized the power of a shared day of gratitude to unify a fractured and weary population during the long struggle for independence. In 1777, following the pivotal American victory at the Battle of Saratoga, the first national proclamation of Thanksgiving was issued to celebrate the defeat of the British forces. However, this was not a day for turkey and football. It was a day for solemn thanksgiving and praise to the Almighty for the success of the revolutionary cause. The language of these early proclamations was dense with academic vocabulary and religious overtones reflecting the gravity of the times. They spoke of the manifestation of divine providence and the unmerited favors bestowed upon the nascent nation. In the previous section, we encountered the phrase "to take root" and the term "nascent." To take root is an idiomatic way to describe an idea or tradition becoming established and firm within a society. Nascent is an academic adjective used to describe something that is just coming into existence and beginning to show signs of future potential. Using nascent instead of young or new will significantly elevate the sophistication of your English descriptions in professional or academic writing. As the 19th century dawned, the holiday faced a period of geographic and cultural fragmentation. While the northern states continued to celebrate Thanksgiving with increasing regularity, the southern states largely ignored the tradition, viewing it as a Yankee imposition. This cultural divide was so pronounced that many Southerners considered the holiday to be a direct affront to their own local customs and social structures. The holiday was also changing in its physical form, moving from the meeting house to the home. The focus shifted toward the family unit, and the harvest being celebrated was increasingly the product of an industrializing economy rather than just the soil. Despite the growing popularity of the domestic feast, the lack of a uniform date created a chaotic patchwork of celebrations across the country. One state might celebrate in October while its neighbour chose a Thursday in December, making it impossible for families spread across state lines to reunite. If the nation had remained a collection of loosely affiliated states without a centralized cultural identity, Thanksgiving might have faded into a regional curiosity. Never before had the holiday been more in need of a champion who could look past regional bickering to see its national potential. At this critical juncture, the holiday found its most persistent advocate in the form of a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. Hale was the influential editor of Godey's Lady's Book, the most popular magazine in America at the time, and she possessed a singular vision for the holiday. She believed that a National Day of Thanksgiving could act as a moral glue to hold the country together as the tensions over slavery began to tear the social fabric apart. For over 30 years, Hale wrote thousands of letters to governors, senators, and presidents pleading with them to establish a permanent national date for the holiday. She argued that a unified day of peace would help to mitigate the growing animosity between the North and the South. Rarely has an individual outside of political office exerted so much influence over the cultural calendar of a nation through sheer persistence. Hale's campaign was not merely about food or family. It was a calculated attempt to use domesticity to prevent a civil war. She filled her magazine with recipes for roast turkey pumpkin pie and stuffing, creating the very traditional menu that we recognize today. Through her writing, she transformed Thanksgiving from a somber religious duty into a warm domestic celebration centered on the hearth and the home. Nevertheless, her appeals were repeatedly ignored by a succession of presidents who were more concerned with the looming political crisis. It would take the most devastating conflict in American history to finally move the needle on Hale's vision. By 1863, the United States was embroiled in a brutal civil war that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and left the nation shattered. In the midst of this darkness, Hale sent yet another letter, this time to President Abraham Lincoln. She argued that in a time of such profound loss, the nation needed a moment of collective reflection and gratitude more than ever before. Lincoln, recognizing the strategic and spiritual value of her request, finally decided to act. He issued a proclamation that established the last Thursday of November as a National Day of Thanksgiving for all Americans. This was a bold move, considering that half of the country was currently in open rebellion against his government. In this chapter, you heard phrases like to exert influence and to move the needle. These are powerful collocations for discussing the impact of leaders and activists on society and policy. Moving the needle is a particularly common idiom in modern business and political English to describe making a noticeable difference in a situation. The holiday was now officially a part of the American landscape, but the road to a truly unified celebration was still fraught with difficulty. Lincoln's proclamation was a wartime measure intended to heal a broken union, but the wounds of the conflict would take generations to close. The next challenge for Thanksgiving would be to survive the end of the war and the transition into a modern industrial era. As the 19th century drew to a close, a new wave of immigrants would arrive, bringing their own traditions and questioning where they fit into this English story. The narrative of the Pilgrims was about to be dusted off and polished for a very specific purpose. A new myth was being born, and it would be more powerful than the history itself. The mid-19th century was a period of existential crisis for the United States, yet amidst the smoke of battle, the modern identity of Thanksgiving was finally forged. While Abraham Lincoln is often credited with the holiday's official birth, the groundwork was laid by a woman whose tireless advocacy spanned decades and survived several administrations. Some historians contend that without the persistent pressure of the press, particularly from female editors, the holiday would have remained a fragmented regional custom. Had Sarah Josepha Hale given up her campaign during the tumultuous 1850s, the unified national celebration we recognize today might never have come to fruition. Rarely has a private citizen utilized the power of the written word so effectively to steer the cultural direction of an entire nation. By the early 1860s, the Civil War had reached a fever pitch, tearing families apart and leaving the social fabric of the country in tatters. Lincoln's decision to issue the 1863 proclamation was not merely a sentimental gesture, but a calculated effort to foster national unity during a time of unprecedented division. The proclamation itself was a masterclass in diplomatic language appealing to the better angels of our nature, even while the country was bleeding. Consequently, Thanksgiving was officially anchored to the last Thursday of November, providing a much-needed sense of stability in an era of chaos. Hale's vision for the holiday was deeply rooted in the concept of domesticity, which she believed was the ultimate stabilizing force for a democratic society. Moreover, she recognized that for a holiday to truly survive, it needed a brand, a set of traditions that could be replicated in every home, regardless of social class. She championed the idea of the New England dinner as the gold standard for the celebration, emphasizing local ingredients that were becoming widely available due to the Industrial Revolution. However, the transition from a wartime mandate to a peacetime tradition was far from a foregone conclusion. In the years following the war, the holiday served as a bridge for reconciliation, helping to reintegrate the southern states into the national narrative. Despite the initial resistance from many Southerners who viewed the holiday as a symbol of Northern dominance, the universal appeal of a family feast eventually won out. The imagery of the holiday also began to shift during this period, moving away from its strictly religious roots toward a more secular, historical theme. It was during the late 19th century that the pilgrim myth began to take center stage in the American imagination. Educators and politicians saw the story of the 1621 feast as a perfect tool for Americanizing the millions of new immigrants arriving from Europe. By emphasizing a story of cooperation and survival, they hoped to instill a sense of shared heritage in a population that was increasingly diverse. In the previous paragraphs, we used the phrase "to come to fruition" and the term "foregone conclusion." To come to fruition is a sophisticated way to describe a plan or project that finally reaches its successful completion. A foregone conclusion refers to a result that is so certain that it can be predicted before it actually happens. In your own writing, using these expressions will help you describe the nuances of planning and historical inevitability more precisely. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the holiday faced a new challenge: the rise of consumer culture and the professionalization of entertainment. The focus of the holiday began to expand from the private dining room to the public square, reflected in the emergence of massive holiday parades. If the retail industry had not recognized the potential of Thanksgiving as the kickoff for the Christmas shopping season, the holiday might have remained a quiet, family-oriented affair. Never before had a religious and historical commemoration been so thoroughly integrated into the machinery of modern capitalism. The Gilded Age brought with it a level of opulence that transformed the Thanksgiving table into a display of wealth and status for the urban elite. While the core menu remained the same, the preparation became more elaborate, reflecting the sophisticated tastes of a nation that was now a global economic power. Simultaneously, the holiday began to take on a more athletic dimension with the birth of the Thanksgiving Day football tradition. The first intercollegiate football game held on Thanksgiving took place in 1876, establishing a link between the holiday and organized sports that persists to this day. This development added a layer of modern ritual that appealed to a broader, more secular audience than the traditional church services. Nevertheless, the spirit of the holiday remained tethered to the idea of giving back to those less fortunate. Charitable organizations began hosting large-scale Thanksgiving dinners for the poor, a practice that reinforced the holiday's image as a time of national benevolence. Hale's original goal of a moral glue was being realized, though perhaps in ways she could never have fully anticipated. The holiday was now a complex hybrid of religious piety, historical mythology, family intimacy, and commercial opportunity. As we examine this era, we see the phrase, "to bridge the gap," and "to be tethered to." Bridging the gap is a common idiom used when something connects two different groups or ideas that are separated by a conflict or difference. Being tethered to describes being strongly connected or limited by a particular thing or idea. These phrases are highly effective for describing connections in history, business, and social movements. The stability of the late November date remained unchallenged until the late 1930s, when another national crisis forced a radical rethink. During the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt attempted to shift the date of Thanksgiving to stimulate the economy. He moved the holiday up by 1 week to lengthen the Christmas shopping season, a move that sparked immediate and intense public outcry. This controversial decision, mockingly dubbed Franksgiving, proved that by 1939 the holiday had become too sacred for even the president to change without resistance. The ensuing confusion saw different states celebrating on different Thursdays, creating a logistical nightmare for families and businesses alike. Eventually, Congress had to intervene to settle the matter once and for all, officially fixing the date by law. This legal intervention marked the final step in the holiday's long journey, from a sporadic religious proclamation to a permanent pillar of the American calendar. While the date was now set in stone, The narrative behind the holiday was about to undergo its most significant challenge yet. As the country moved toward the mid-20th century, new voices began to question the Pilgrim and Indian story that had been sold to generations of school children. The silence of those who had been excluded from the first Thanksgiving narrative was finally beginning to be heard. A new era of reflection was on the horizon, one that would force the nation to look more honestly at its own origins. The story was no longer just about survival. It was about memory and the cost of progress. In 1924, a group of Macy's department store employees organized a Christmas parade that would eventually evolve into the world's most famous Thanksgiving spectacle. While we now associate the event with giant helium balloons and pop stars, the inaugural parade actually featured live animals borrowed from the Central Park Zoo. This shift from a somber religious day to a vibrant commercial celebration reflects the broader transformation of American society during the 20th century. If those early 20th century workers could see the millions of viewers tuning in today via satellite and streaming, they would likely be astounded by the sheer scale of the event. Rarely has a corporate promotion so successfully integrated itself into the cultural fabric of a national holiday. The mid-20th century was characterized by the rapid commercialization of the holiday as businesses recognized the immense potential of the 4-day weekend. Consequently, the Friday following Thanksgiving, now universally known as Black Friday, became the most significant shopping day of the year. This phenomenon has often been criticized for overshadowing the original message of gratitude with a frenzy of consumerism and material desire. Moreover, the introduction of television further cemented the link between the holiday and professional sports, specifically American football. For many families, the sound of the game in the background has become as much a part of the tradition as the smell of the roasting turkey. By the 1960s, the holiday had become a cornerstone of the American civil religion, a shared ritual that bridged the gap between different faiths and backgrounds. However, as the nation moved into the late 20th century, the traditional narrative of the holiday began to face intense scrutiny. In 1970, a group of Native American activists declared a National Day of Mourning to coincide with the 350th anniversary of the landing at Plymouth. They argued that the popular story of the first Thanksgiving ignored the devastating impact of European colonization on indigenous populations. This movement sparked a necessary, if uncomfortable, conversation about how a nation remembers its own history and at what cost. The conflict between the romanticized myth and the lived reality of indigenous people continues to shape modern discussions about the holiday's meaning. In this final section, you heard phrases like "to coincide with" and "to face intense scrutiny." Coinciding with is an academic way to describe two events happening at the same time, often by design or significant chance. Facing intense scrutiny is a powerful collocation used when something is being examined very closely and critically by the public or experts. Try using scrutiny in your workplace or academic discussions to describe a process of rigorous evaluation. Despite these complex debates, the core elements of the holiday family food and gratitude have remained remarkably resilient. The modern Thanksgiving table is a reflection of a globalized world, often featuring dishes that would have been unrecognizable to the original pilgrims. In many households, traditional turkey is now accompanied by tamales spring rolls or curries, reflecting the diverse heritage of the contemporary population. This culinary evolution proves that traditions are not static. They are living things that adapt to the needs and identities of the people who practice them. Never before has the concept of giving thanks been more inclusive or more contested than it is in the 21st century. The holiday serves as a mirror, reflecting both the highest ideals and the most difficult contradictions of the American experience. It is a time when the entire country seems to pause, creating a rare moment of collective stillness in an increasingly fast-paced world. The act of sitting down to a meal with loved ones remains a powerful antidote to the isolation of the digital age. If we look closely at the history of this holiday, we see a story of survival, adaptation, and the persistent search for common ground. It is a reminder that even in the face of deep division, the simple act of sharing a meal can be a profound gesture of peace. As we conclude this journey through time, we must reflect on the fact that history is not just a collection of dates, but a living narrative that we continue to write. The lessons of the past of lost cooperation and the struggle for identity are more relevant today than ever before. The tradition of Thanksgiving will undoubtedly continue to evolve, reflecting the changing values of future generations. While the myths may change, the human need for connection and gratitude remains a universal constant. The real story of Thanksgiving is not found in the textbooks, but in the quiet conversations around a million different tables. That is the lasting legacy of 1621. The feast continues,